Thank you, Mr. Dihakar, for bringing us what is blockchain, the history of blockchain, architecture, design and protocol, the permissioned blockchain, and presented us a few projects. Thank you so much. Now we are moving to the cybersecurity world. And to present us and to talk about this topic, we have Mrs. Kadri Kaska from NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. Mrs. Kadri?
Hello and a very good afternoon from my side as well. Can we have the slides, please? I would really like to extend my thanks to Commissioner Viso, the ICT department of the Government of Nagaland, and not least the e-Governance Academy for having me here. It's truly a pleasure and a joy. I've been moved by your hospitality here. I've been impressed by your vision for e-governance, both in terms of its ambition and substance. And I consider myself privileged to be a small part of something that I believe is truly making an impact and shaping a more prosperous future for the people of Nagaland. So, by means of introduction, next slide please, meanwhile as well. The organization that I come from, the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, which is always a bit of a tongue twister for everybody, is actually a NATO-affiliated think tank located in Tallinn, Estonia. So we do not represent NATO official policy or official position. We are rather called to help our member countries, which are both NATO allies as well as like-minded countries from around the globe, to advance both their thinking and cooperation in cybersecurity. But I have also worked for the Estonian government, and my presentation that I would like to give you is mostly coming from that perspective. So there are two topics that I would like to cover. Sort of the evolution of the cyber threat and trends as in the threat landscape as we see them today, and then what can we do and what have we seen as working in defending the digital societies. So whether we consider ourselves leaders or participants or choose to ignore the digital development, we are all impacted by the evolving digital environment. The old truism that no one is an island fully applies here, in that in a networked society, no state, no individual, no organization can really consider or can really go unimpacted. So the growth of the digital domain, more users, more connections, more data processed, more traffic, obviously means more opportunities. But understandably, the growth in that regard also means a growing cyber attack surface. And I wouldn't really view it as a downside of the digital development. It's simply a feature that has to be taken into account. Everything that can be used can also be misused, and cyber is no different in that regard, and we shouldn't sort of keep the illusion that we can somehow avoid the misuse. So in a bit of a reflection back into the past couple of decades, in the early days of the World Wide Web, cyber threats mostly amounted to what we would consider a nuisance. So email wouldn't work, there were data breaches, things like that. Since the turn of the millennium, with more stakes in the game, more money, more value, cybercrime began to flourish. But the global wake-up call to cyber threats really came with a 2007 coordinated cyber attacks against one entire country, which fortunately or unfortunately was ours again, Estonia, after which the international community began to understand that cyber attacks can potentially have national security implications and national security significance. So we saw we saw political tensions between countries spill over from the physical space into cyberspace. And a year later, in the Russia-Georgia conflict, cyber attacks were already part of the excuse me, part of the conflict, and that pattern has remained ever since. Thus far, there had not been any significant impact to essential services, and that changed with, in December 2015, when a local electric grid in Ukraine was disabled by a targeted malware attack that was later identified as originating from Russia. And of course, last year's global malware campaigns, WannaCry and NotPetya, caused widespread indiscriminate damage where essential services from transportation to healthcare to financial entities were impacted the world over. And in about the same time frame, those combined cyber attacks and propaganda attacks against elections, so against the core of democratic societies, the democratic processes came into the picture. First, when the mail accounts of top US presidential campaign figures were breached with their private discussions or internal discussions published on the web and later spinned with made-up information, or what we now know as the fake news, and sort of that the facts and the fake were spinned in order to achieve a certain political aim. And this pattern has repeated since in France. We've seen it in the UK, we've seen it in Montenegro, also Kenya last year. So who is attacking and why? Can I have the next slide? First of all, and this is by and far the vast majority of the threat picture or the cyber attacks as we see them today, is cybercrime, which is increasingly organized, which is increasingly professional, and which by the very nature of it disregards national borders. The attacker can be or appear to be wherever on the globe. To impact a company in India or in Estonia. According to the Estonian CERT, so the Computer Emergency Response Team, they perhaps see 1 or 2 incidents per year where the attacker and the victim are both located in Estonia. With the rest, it's coming from various countries around the globe. The challenge, of course, is that our law enforcement is very much defined by the principle of territoriality, so it's defined by the national borders. Adaptable and specialized is something that also applies to, is true of the cybercrime industry. An example of the adaptability is, for example, in the past few years, we saw loads of ransomware attacks that were professionally made, so I mean set up in a way that the potential victim would really pick up the hook and become infected, and their files would be locked and they would pay the ransomware. This year we've actually, and this applies to Estonia and other countries in Europe, but it also seems to apply the world over, the focus has starkly shifted away from ransomware and moved into cryptocurrency attacks. So attacking cryptocurrency platforms, vendors, wallets, whatnot. Then the second major category of cyber threat is states. What is characteristic of their behavior is that they're well-resourced, they're very patient, and they have long-term political interests in, so both political and economic influence in mind. So while the cybercrime is very much focused on grab the money and run, the state-sponsored cyber threats are interested in getting a presence on the network and remaining silent for a long time, collecting information and preparing for a potential later operation, whether it's espionage or sabotage. It's very much up to the interest at the time. And then, of course, what is sort of empowering or facilitating the behavior of both cybercrime and hostile states is on the one hand technology itself, dependency on technology as a source of vulnerability in its own right, vulnerabilities in both new and old technologies. New in the sense of we don't quite have a good understanding yet what all those new forms of digital tools and services and forms of enterprise actually carry. And old risks in the sense that for technology or digital solutions developed a while ago, we have become more efficient in identifying the vulnerabilities, but at the same time the industry is no longer supporting those solutions, so no patches, no fixes are being issued for those. And then, of course, the behavior of people, it's a rather frequent statement you hear in cybersecurity settings that human is clearly the weakest link in this formula. Both low awareness and poor cyber hygiene, so lack of culture of ownership. Cybersecurity is still very often viewed as something very technical that somebody else takes care or has to take care of for me. And then a lack of simple cyber hygiene practices such as using strong passwords rather than the insecurest password in the world, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, as we've learned from the numerous data breaches. And in Estonia's terms, or based on Estonia's statistics, over 60% of all cyber incidents are the product of a combination of outdated software and lack of cyber hygiene, so uninformed, unaware behavior of the user. And I mean, this is clearly where the government alone cannot resolve much. The government cannot come and patch the businesses' software for them, or, well, technically they could, but I doubt we would like to live in such societies, of course. Then, against this background, with the cyber threats becoming more significant, potentially more harmful, and the awareness of users lagging behind, and secure technology, or secure by default or by design technology not really catching up either. What are we protecting? Understanding that we, as much resources that we have that we can potentially invest in, we cannot do everything. Estonia has for a number of years now, more than a decade, worked with the understanding that we are not primarily working in order to secure the technology. We are really protecting the habitual digital way of life for the society, for the people, that we are protecting and working to defend our values and trust in technology. So, and the way we have done it is what I would call the comprehensive national cybersecurity system. It's not an official term, but the approach is very much systematic and comprehensive. For one thing, the secure fundamental infrastructure. My colleagues earlier talked about the X-Road, talked about the digital ID. So solutions that underpin our digital ecosystem and that are developed with security in mind. The use of such solutions in both public and private sector services has meant, amongst other things, that Estonia has, for example, had no serious data breaches for really not just the past few years, but for pretty much the entire duration of our digital ecosystem. Baseline security frameworks as a second, in the form of, for one thing, legal obligations for essential service providers, so telcos, energy, transportation, healthcare, other services like that, to ensure cybersecurity. But beyond the legal obligations or the legal frameworks, also tools and guidelines that the state offers to the service providers and government entities. Also security testing services, for example, offered to them. Then secondly, the clear division of roles and responsibilities, having the organizational capacity to be prepared for and be able to respond to or mitigate cyber threats. But beyond simply defining the roles and responsibilities, also empowering those organizations. We set up around-the-clock monitoring of cyber threats about 3 years ago, and our ability to discover cyber incidents and react much sooner to mitigate and contain the damage has drastically improved since then. Then awareness raising and competence building across government, but also across society, across service providers, issuing threat warnings by the state, public guidelines to assist the service providers in securing their systems, in their developing or doing their network architecture in a more secure manner, and so on. What we also have is cyber hygiene testing that is available across the public service free of charge, but we've also now launched it to some essential service providers, and in particular the primary health care, so the medical doctors, for example, have access to the tool so that they can identify where their own weak spots are, and also learn how to improve their behavior to be more secure in their digital handling. And then last but perhaps even the most important, cooperation. So breaking the isolation or this rather natural inclination towards silo-based management of cybersecurity and digital development, because cybersecurity can never really be handled by one entity alone. So it means working with private sector service providers, but also with other countries, in both in shaping the environment and handling incidents. And the next and the last slide. So what we have learned from our 10 plus years of practice is that there is really no such thing as 100% security 100% of the time. The only impenetrable system is as well known as one that is disconnected and unplugged. That unfortunately is not working either, but it's definitely secure. But this is clearly not the state we are striving for. So the realization that even with the best defenses, incidents will happen. We have invested our effort and our focus into being prepared to come through them, so that cyber incidents would not have a disruptive effect upon government functions, upon business interests and business operation, and of course, most of all, upon the society. So what we have learned, and what I would like to sum up in those 3 pillars and boxes as the very fundamental things to do nationally in order to meet the future with relative certainty, is, for one thing, securing the critical functions, so essential services and also public administration. So thinking security from the start, security by design, building systems secure, penetration testing them before releasing them to use, or before launching them, knowing the systems that we operate. Secondly, knowing our dependencies and our vulnerabilities. How much are your essential services like electricity or communications dependent on ICT for their continuous operation? and then planning for when things go wrong, because they rather inevitably will at some point. So having a continuity plan for those cases, thinking about what needs to be done, who can help you, who needs to know, how would you proceed. Then the second pillar is situational awareness and threat preparedness. Incident monitoring is part of that. Besides knowing your systems, knowing what is going on in your systems, what are the current threats, what is relevant for you in what is happening in the threat landscape. And then information sharing about your discoveries, both about the threats that you see, attacker behavior, solutions and guidelines and tools that could help to mitigate those threats. Because again, the government cannot do everything on its own. It's a shared responsibility where every business and every citizen has a duty of care, but the governments can equip and empower them to do that or fulfill that duty of care effectively. And then finally, the last box, the processes and mechanisms entails having a legal framework to empower and enforce cybersecurity. But it's not just tools of enforcement by the state, but it's also a systematic investment into community building and cooperation that is meaningful and valuable for the parties. So involving not just the government, or not just operating solely with a government entity that is responsible for digital development and cybersecurity, but also involving the essential service providers, involving the tech community, involving other ministries, and really seeking to provide value and tools for them. And it also entails having a statewide process agreed in case things, like I said, in case things go wrong. So who coordinates incident resolution, what are the roles, and how to communicate with the partners and with the public. So this concludes my presentation. I will be happy to answer your questions and discuss with you later in the Q&A session and after the event as well.